Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is Bob Clements, and I'll get to formal introductions here in just a minute. But while we started in the general content, I guess what I'd like to do is start by talking about a couple of upcoming events that I'd like to make you aware of and hopefully put on your calendar. So the first is actually another webinar that we're doing week. Next week, we're doing a webinar with our client Zoomies as well as with Infor to really talk about Zoomies' deployment of Infor's workforce management solution to their stores. Joining us from Zoomies will be Jesse Higgins, the Director of Store Operations, as well as Robin Merritt, the Senior Vice President for Global Delivery Services at Axsium, and then finally Robert Means from Infor, who's the Vice President of Business and Market Development for Infor's Retail WFM group. The session is next week on the 24th at 11 a.m. and at Eastern Time. I hope it's something that you can join us for. We'll be sending out an email about this, so if you haven't had a chance to register, there'll be a registration link in that email. Coming up shortly after the webinar then is Kronos Works. Now, today we're going to be talking about Save Mart's deployment of Workforce Dimensions and how we collaboratively built a store-specific labor model for them. But if you're going to be attending Kronos Works, Axsium is certainly going to be there as well. We'll be having a booth at the Expo Center, but we're also going to be presenting a dimension-centric version of this presentation, and it'll be an opportunity to be a little bit more active and do a little bit more Q&A. So if you're going to be at Kronos Works, feel free to stop by our booth and also come by our session, which is from 4 to 5 o'clock on the Monday of Kronos Works. Last but not least, as we look to the spring, please mark on your calendar our upcoming live Axsium WFM forums. So our UK forum this year is going to be held at the Lord's Cricket Grounds in London. So it makes it very, very convenient for those that are in and around London or maybe coming in to the UK for the event. The event is going to be on the 19th and the 20th of March, and if you're in the UK, I hope you certainly can attend. Again, we'll be sending out a formal save the date and registration links as well. But the plan for the UK forum is to be in London on the March 20th or 19th and 20th. The US forum is planned for New Orleans this year. We were in Nashville last year, and continuing on in the good food and good music theme, we're going to be in New Orleans this year from April 22nd and 23rd. So hopefully you'll be able to attend one of those events. If you haven't been to one of the live events before, they're fantastic because it really is a very limited group, a very tight-knit group, community of retail WFM experts from Axsium as well as from the retail industry. Lots of great information is exchanged, and I hope that you can attend. So without further ado, why don't we go ahead and start to turn our attention to this session today. So a couple of logistics before we get started. First and foremost, while we're presenting today and WebEx doesn't provide us with as much interaction as we normally would like in a live session, well, this is a live session, but if we were face-to-face, please feel free to ask us questions. In the bottom right-hand corner of your user interface for WebEx, QA section and a QA panel, it might be collapsed with a little caret kind of pointing to the right, and if it is, you can click on it and expand it. Feel free to ask questions throughout. I will try to moderate the questions as they come in, and if appropriate, we'll interrupt. We do have a little bit of time saved at the end for Q&A. Feel free to ask questions as they come up. We're anxious to hear from you and hear what your questions are and try to address what your needs are as we get into the presentation itself. We also will make this recording available afterwards, so if somebody is not able to, if you can't stay on for the whole time, I hope you are, or if you wanted to share this presentation afterwards, you're certainly welcome to do that with the link that we provide. So I think that's it from a logistics perspective. Why don't we get started by introducing who our speakers are today. Our first speaker, well, actually, we're going to be talking as a group, but the person I'd like to introduce first, Mike Farago. Mike is the Director of Store Labor Efficiencies at Save Mart. Mike, would you like to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Fargo. I work for Save Mart supermarkets in Northern California. I've been in the grocery business 33 years. Since 1996, I've been in the workforce management field, specifically around labor standards, scheduling, forecasting, and process improvement and budgeting. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. And then we also have joining us today is Luke Mueller-Liley. Luke is our productivity practice lead at Axsium Group. Luke, can you take a minute to introduce yourself?
Everyone. I've been in retail for 14 years now, spanning finance, operations, and workforce management. And as part of my role as practice lead of our productivity services and solutions, I oversee our labor standards development capabilities, process improvement, org design and analysis, all of which you'll see a sliver of today, as well as our Opus and Studia products, of which Opus will be featured highly today, and Studia, our mobile data collection and labor study app.
Thanks, Luke. And last but not least, I'm Bob Clements. I'm going to be your host for today. For those that might not have met me before, I'm the president of Axsium. I've been involved in retail or retail workforce management for virtually all of my career, having led strategy for various WFM products. And for the last 10 years, I've been at Axsium, helping us evolve our services and becoming what I believe is the leader in retail workforce management consulting. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this back over to Mike and ask Mike to provide a little bit of a background of who Save Mart is, in case you're not familiar with their brands. So Mike?
Thanks, Bob. So Save Mart is made up of 3 banners. We have Lucky California in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have our Food Max, which is a box retailer, our discount retailer, and we have Save Mart, which is our conventional banner in the California Central Valley. We have 208 stores in Northern California, stretching from Sacramento down to Bakersfield area and out to the coast in San Francisco and all the way over to Reno, Nevada. We have 14,000 employees that we schedule and use in time and attendance dimension, and that's who we are.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. When we engaged together, or I guess what was the impetus for this project was that you were kind of facing a time of transition with your solution. Can you tell us a little bit about kind of where you were and what your vision was for the future?
Sure. So when I got to Save Mart, we have, like everyone, we have a great philosophy around labor management, meaning I believe we want to measure our work, and we've been using measurements from the past in a system called DLM, Dynamic Labor Management. And that was all built in Excel models throughout the whole company, and they've been built for 7 to 8 years and hadn't been updated. And it was clear as we were building labor and using DLM to build labor up for our stores, we were constantly making adjustments for new programs that we hadn't measured. It also very clunky for our stores to manage and forecast labor using all the different Excel workbooks, different models, different spreadsheets, to then get into our time and our workforce management system called Tomax, which we had been given notice was going end of life in June of 2019. So between the need to update our labor model, the need to update our technology, the need to simplify our process for our stores, and the need to replace our WFM system, we decided we needed to move forward into the future. So through we selected Opus, Bob. So we moved to Opus so that we had one place where we could build and maintain standards, all of our profiles, all in one location. And from the past, I knew it was really important that whatever solution we selected for labor standard had to integrate with our new WFM solution we were working on selecting. So because of that, we selected Opus, because we knew that it integrated seamlessly with Kronos Workforce Central, and they were also developing a integration into Kronos Dimensions, so that it was really important that we had one place to go and one place to manage all of our labor for everything we need for our stores. So it was really we needed to start from scratch and rebuild everything, and those were the key pieces why we selected Opus and Dimensions, so that we could manage it in one place.
And what was astounding to me is you and I probably started talking about this, maybe in the spring of 2018, and you got an end of life date for Tomax, meaning that it was going to go away in June of 2019. So less than 18 months. Kind of you had the idea that you had to switch off. What did your timeline look like? How did you actually? I guess did you accomplish the goal, and what did your timeline look like?
So our timeline was very aggressive. We found out in May of 2018 that we had to replace our WFM system. Not where I would like to start a project like this, knowing I had to get a new WFM system in place. I think it's really important, and everyone agree, you'd want to build your labor standards, then roll out a time and attendance system, and then integrate forecasting and scheduling. In a lot of ways, I knew we had to go backwards and start with get a new WFM system, but also rebuild our model. Why go through the pain of a new WFM system if you didn't have your foundation set? So we set the stage to then rebuild and select Opus and Axsium with Opus to rebuild our labor standards. So we had two projects in parallel. So we were working on Dimensions, and we were engaged with Axsium and Opus to rebuild all of our labor standards. In the meantime,
and just to call it out too, while this isn't really a Dimensions focused presentation, you were probably one of the first retailers to adopt Dimensions or to decide to adopt Dimensions at this point. Isn't that the case?
My understanding is we were the first in September of 2018 to sign up for Dimensions. Maybe sign up, might be the first or one of the first, but we're clearly the first to deploy and get Kronos Dimensions in our stores. So we had that two-track piece, which actually worked out really well in a lot of decisions and data, and we'll talk about some of data and partnership with Axsium. I'm a big believer in one team, so we brought Axsium on through this whole process and kept them informed of everything we're doing with Dimensions. That helped inform how we built our labor standards. So you can see we selected Dimensions. Then as the same path is, we're now engaged with the Axsium team on their methodology with my team to start conducting in-store studies. And I'm going to say this is when Axsium reached out to me, and when the RFP was put in place in their timeline, we were slated to be done in 3 or 4 months, a total rebuild of our labor model. And I remember pushing back to Bob and the team and saying, "Are you sure we can get it done? Are you sure we can get it done? Because, this takes time." And they just assured me that they would with their methodology. And sure enough, we had our labor model developed on time and in budget, and we presented our findings to our leaders in February of 2019. At the same time, Axsium also worked on the integration of Opus with Dimensions and started that development and delivered that on time as well. In the meantime, we started our Dimensions implementation. We had the integration of the Opus labor models into Dimension. Right in time, we were started piloting in April of 2019. Our Dimensions stores, so forecasting and scheduling. And we completed our rollout July 18, 2019. So within 3 months, we deployed every store in our company on forecasting and scheduling and unplugged Tomax. So that was our aggressive timeline. So in that time frame, rebuilt all of our department's labor standards, selected WFM, configured a WFM, shared with our leaders the impact of the labor standards rebuild, piloted, integrated, and rolled out.
And just to clarify too, when we talk about Dimensions in this context, our main focus, or your main focus for here, was really around forecasting and scheduling. And we'll talk a little bit more about how time and attendance came in later on. But this is an amazing timeline to get on. And to your point, I remember having those conversations with you early on in the process about the timeline and could we accomplish the timeline and could we get it done. And I think that one of the keys to our success is the way that we approached the labor model rebuild. And what I'd like to do is bring Luke into this conversation, talk a little bit about what that approach was and explained how we, kind of took a different approach with different aspects of the labor model based on what based on the status and the need of the business was at the time. So, Luke, do you want to pick up the story from here?
Absolutely, yeah. So, as Mike mentioned, we were starting from scratch in terms of preparing for a new workforce management deployment with Dimensions, but there was an existing labor model. So we did our best to find the most efficient route to replacing some existing standards where core tasks aligned with standards we have already built over the decades in the Axsium industry database that comes with Opus. A combination of that and remeasuring areas, as Mike said, there's new business initiatives that have gone into place since his DLM model had been built and hadn't yet been accounted for. So these are areas that we studied and built using Axiom's engineered methodology. And then finally, recycle. These were areas that might have been labor gaps, might have been areas that we produced some updated standards, not applied right out of the gate in Dimensions due to other overriding business rules like minimum coverage or things like that are required for scheduling purposes, but still gave Mike and team a bit of a what if on what the true demand, if you will, the true business volumes for these activities entailed. So it was with that hybrid approach, you could call it, that we were able to stand up this labor model in just over 3 months. And to illustrate each of these examples, I'll just take you through an example of each that I think benefited Save Mart both for this aggressive timeline as well as long run and sustainability. So for replacing the existing core standards with industry standards, the key here was the existing standards. As you can see, there's an example here for scan item, was a single time value. And so if there was ever a process change or new technology, new scanners, it would involve Mike and team going out and conducting time studies, basically starting from scratch. Whereas the methodology we use in Opus for these repeatable type of tasks comes with detail, comes with all the detailed process steps, or we call them foundations, that can help Mike and his team manage this over the long haul. So instead of re-measuring the entire process, they could insert adjustments or changes as they go. So this resulted in far less work than we would have otherwise had building from scratch, but also gave Save Mart the ability to benchmark some of their core tasks against what we call industry standards and the tools to support any maintenance, on this standard going forward.
Luke, just let me jump in here for a minute. But for those that haven't seen Opus before, this is the on the screens. There is a small screenshot of within Opus the foundations or the building block elements that make up a labor standard. And in this case, it's illustrating what the scan item is, the scan item standard is. So just if you haven't had a chance to see it before, that's a small screenshot of it. And if you're interested in a bit more of a demo, we're happy to show that later on. So back over to you, Luke.
Yeah, and Mike had the vision here, having gone through different projects like this before in past lives, to understand that you could look at this and say, all right, the scan item value is very similar between what they had and what the Opus standard was. So why not just keep the existing? Well, the goal here was to contain all of those elements that go into the standard, so his team could actively know and defend really what the standard was as questions come up, and maintain over time. In the second category around remeasuring or in some cases measuring for the first time was for unique tasks that Save Mart hadn't yet deployed into their labor model, and we're going to be a part of this new regime in Dimensions. So for some of the more immature businesses, areas like the burrito nacho bar, for example, in their conventional formats, we employed our engineering methodology to measure these tasks built from the ground up. Of having to conduct lengthy time studies like Mike and his team had done in the past, we simply needed to capture the process done properly once, end to end. Then our engineers could analyze the video we captured, build a labor standard based on the body motions and factor in any location-specific nuances or attributes that influenced how the process was completed, like steps to the kitchen, for example. Another efficiency for this project was the fact that Mike and his team of store managers actually helped capture a lot of this video for these areas. So they could easily validate that these methods were being applied and inform our team whether any store profiles or specific properties could influence the labor required. So as Mike said, it was a real collaborative approach to building this out. And the third approach we took was around, recycling some of the existing assumptions, but um, uh, supplementing that with some new insights that Mike could take to his team. And so this is where, there was some newness as well. Meat grill, rather, was a relatively new feature within some of the Save Mart locations, and they had opened up that process with a baseline coverage of 56 hours a week to cover kind of the store traffic. However, we went and built out the detailed steps that it took to both open, close, and support the service elements and production elements throughout the day. And what we found was, in this particular case, the demand we were seeing in this relatively new area of business wasn't quite up to what the overall coverage needs were in scheduling. And so, in such cases, in the short run, Save Mart elected to keep these coverage rules in place, but they have these standards now to go back to and perform, what we could call a what if analysis or ROI type analysis to inform their business partners of these trade-offs. And so, I don't know if Mike, you want to explain a little further about what that meant for you.
So I'm a big believer that labor is not a strategy, but labor supports strategy. So in this case, I was able to go to my leaders and say, look, the work for these meat grills in this store is about 21 and a half hours a week based on what they're selling to our customers. So I could either incorporate the work into the budgets, or I could support or we could put in 56 hours in our budgets to say we want a person there available for our customers. So by building out the standards and saying what if, I can then tell my leaders, what strategy do you want to support our stores, and what strategy, how do you want me to budget this element in our store? So it really gave our leaders the choice to make and say, look, we need to grow that business. So thank you for measuring the work and telling us it's 21 and a half hours, but we're going to invest the hours in service and try to grow that business. So for our budgets and in our schedules, we have the standard coverage, 56 hours. But I can continue to go back and say that coverage is costing us 34 hours, 28 hours, we're growing the business. So it really was a way to tell my leaders how we could measure work or how we can invest in service. And it was a great conversation with our leaders around that. So.
I saw there's a question out there, and I think it's a good time to just address that. The question is, what standards methodology is used in Opus? MTM, which is short for Methods Time Measurement, or MOST, which is a similar approach that has been introduced first by Maynard and then and is employed in other systems. Really, Opus is agnostic to the approach. So it's possible, while most of our foundations have been built in MTM, we have clients today that are using MOST methodology as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
Up that theme, Luke, we've also had a couple of customers that have converted over from Standards Pro into Opus, and they've been able to bring those standards over as well.
Yep, and so really what this work did in a very aggressive timetable is set the foundation for some of the design decisions that needed to be made, basically in parallel with the Dimensions project. So Mike's going to walk us through three key themes of where this work in building out the labor model and assessing both the data, the org structure, and the integration helped enable that process for his team.
So data drives everything in labor. We all know that. So we've had to make decisions on what data we needed. So that was a lot of work we did with the Opus team, understanding our data, what we wanted to forecast, and we made the choice early on. Kronos is where we're going to feed that, where we're going to forecast that data, and we're not going to maintain it in Opus. In Opus, we made the decision early on that there was things that matter from a labor, but we didn't want to get so granular and forecast it. So it was kind of this balance, and there was tons of conversation with the Opus team and the Save Mart team around what is really the volume driver, what's going to be a static driver, where we're going to manage each piece of it. So that's that representation. And I suggest as you go down this path, you really have data-driven conversations early to reduce rework later and understand your data. So once we had those conversations, you can see we have that source system, which is our 1010 or our POS system, and then we're feeding that and mapping it in so that we can pull it and decide where each category goes and map it prior to getting into Opus and Kronos. We actually feed the same data from Kronos, our 15-minute day drivers, into Dimensions. We actually also feed it at a rolled-up level into our Opus tool. So what we've done, and we've made the decision, because I knew we wanted to budget using Opus, I needed the source data to line up. So all my volume drivers that Kronos is forecasting or Dimensions is forecasting, I'm also feeding in weekly into Opus so that I can go back and create fixed and variable factors for my store. And it was really important that I tied all my data together so that the outcomes for schedules mirror the outcomes for budgets on a weekly basis. So a lot of work was done with Opus, Axsium, specifically Luke, around what matters, what's forecasting, doing a lot of work to, and in a lot of ways, configure our Opus system to get into our Dimension system so that we can then budget so that they all tie together. Don't underestimate how important this is as a team, and spend some time up front understanding your data and working with your Axsium team to understand it and help them help so that engineers know how to drive the standards, know what we're managing where, and how to manage that on an updated basis.
One thing I just wanted to highlight of what Mike said was what I thought Mike's vision from the start was very innovative in that, and in here knowing he had to solve for two systems, and so what's described down here, what's pictured down here, is essentially an ecosystem that he worked with his IT partners, his business partners on. Their existing world did not contain the up-to-date mappings of what SKU maps to what particular driver. And so it's very difficult to keep that up to date. So this whole process, I think, I've learned from this and have been encouraging other customers to take a similar approach, because what it does is it doesn't only solve for what you need for WFM, but it solves for making the most out of your Opus deployment. It's not just a one-time exercise to validate standards in Opus, but it's an ongoing exercise, as Mike said, and we'll talk about a little more later, to use Opus on an ongoing basis to support process changes or budgeting for the upcoming year. So this is kind of a foundational item to do all of that work.
I have a question from the audience, and the question is how did you account for LFLs and rounding that exists in Kronos but does not exist in Opus?
Sure. So the easy answer is where in most departments, I'm saying, here's my need in Opus. If you just take the workload, here's the need. Where I need to, for coverage reasons, and I'll go back to my meat grill, I create the coverage standards so that I don't have to worry about the LFL in Kronos for the meat grill. In most of my departments, I don't have many LFLs. I'm not using many LFLs. I'm letting the work determine the jobs, but it also took some work to group the standards at the job level correctly so that I didn't have really small allocations of labor where I'm budgeting a small amount for that. So I'll use my my GM clerks. So I do budget GM I don't have an LFL to give a minimum number, but I did create distribution sets that say, okay, I'm going to distribute this small amount of labor in these period of times so that the rounding rules in Kronos and the distribution labor seem to match up. So I think I only have an LFL for Scott lanes, for meat cutters, and that's about it. So other than that, I let the workload drive the labor allocations and dimensions. And that also mirrors my budgeting. So now their budget's based on true work, not I got to give this person this many hours. If that's the case, I built the standards that way. Did that answer your question?
I think so, but I'll let Greg follow up if he's got further questions. So why don't we move on to the next point?
It's a good segue actually to what Mike was speaking to is the relationship between tasks and jobs, and ultimately to take the scheduling level of detail, granularity within his future dimension system.
Thanks, Lou. So in Tomax, our old WFM system, we built, the hierarchy was really aligned to our union contracts. So our departments, multi-purpose clerks, we didn't really break out a lot. So you see we had very minimal jobs in Tomax and minimal departments. So one of the tasks that I was given by our owner was to create a front-end department. And you'll notice on the Tomax side, checkers and our person in charge and our front-end supervisor were all part of front-end total grocery. So when we were working with Opus and we knew we had selected Kronos for dimensions, we needed to make sure we could measure work at the levels that made sense. And I wanted to get more granular. I kept getting questions like, how much do we spend in dairy? Well, we couldn't really tell. We didn't have labor standards for it. The stores just scheduled what they want. So now that we have labor standards, it was really important to pull that out. And you can see we combined some things, so we created just a total grocery department, but we also broke out cashiers and our front-end supervisors and our Scott lanes out of it. We also created some new departments that didn't exist before. So our admin department, so our receivers, our inventory control clerk, scan, we wanted to take those out of grocery so we could truly measure center store productivity versus store to store and take the noise out of how many price changes and receiver hours, more things that benefit the whole store. So we totally created a new business structure. Opus, working with our Axsium partners, we grouped our labor standards to each one of these jobs. So that also helped not having to have LFLs. We had the task and the work that went to each one of these jobs. And we're also able to measure our labor at a more granular level. So it was a big change for Save Mart to move to this new structure.
I think, as Mike said, in some cases it was more granular. In other cases, it was a step up, and I think that's a key call out. It's not always one direction here. But the key theme is getting ahead of your WFM deployment with any of these transformation opportunities, and certainly without the labor standards, the labor model to drive that, whatever level it is, it can be a very difficult square peg round hole type thing on the WFM side. So this is a key activity we encourage all clients to take on in advance of a WFM implementation. Third category had everything to do, and I think this is Mike's favorite topic, around the integration and the connectivity between these two systems. So Mike, you want to talk about how that set you up both for your testing, pilot, and ultimate sustainment of this ecosystem?
Sure. So one of the main deciding points of Opus and Kronos was I knew the integration. I don't want to manage multiple systems. I want to be able to manage one system. So it was super important to me that we had an integration where I could manage my labor standards in one system, Opus, and I could export it into my workforce management system, and they're always in sync. So that was huge in our decision point, and knowing that Axsium had already integrated into Workforce Central, and it was on their roadmap and part of our statement of work that they would integrate into Kronos Dimensions was a huge deciding factor. So I'm a huge believer, even if I didn't have labor standards and I had Kronos for scheduling, I'd still use Opus to manage my jobs and tasks. It's just easier to configure an Opus and then pass along into Kronos. I also love the ability, the effective dating, and the ability to update my standards based on conditions, or like I have a new program that our bakery merchandisers want to roll out, a new bread baking program. Because I have Opus and I can update that standard, I can now update my store workload to match the new programs on demand. And that was a big deal for us, especially if we're in a payroll crunch or we have a work efficiency that we found we can take that labor on a weekly basis. So that seamless labor model integration matters, and it allows my team to really focus on their work instead of configuring Kronos all the time or configuring Opus. It's seamless. It just happens and takes minutes to update my labor standards.
Thanks for that shout out there, Mike. I think that, we were so happy that we had integration with Workforce Central before, and being able to help the first Workforce Dimensions forecasting customer have that same integration in Workforce Dimensions is big for us. I think it's big for Kronos, and clearly it has a very positive impact for you. Before we move on, and what I want to do is talk kind of next, we're going to talk about how this wasn't just a one and done, we built our labor standards and we're finished, but how is it going to be sustained and used going forward? Before we get to that, though, we have a couple of questions, and I think the first question that I want to address is the second one that came in. And I realized that we were talking in a little bit of Kronos jargon before. Could you describe, either Luke or Mike, what an LFL is for the purposes of for the audience that may not be familiar with it?
Luke, do you want to take it or do you want me to?
I can take it, sure. So an LFL is Kronos speak for a staffing minimum or maximum, basically. So it stands for labor forecast limit. That gets defined at a job level where you're scheduling in the system. And so that can act as an additional aspect of an overall labor model, to where, as the example Mike gave with the meat grill, if the what you could call the raw labor model, the true business volume need is 20-ish hours, 21 hours, the need to cover a particular area, whether it's the grill in that case or your front end lanes, wherever you have rules like that, where we need to have at least one person in a particular location or job, sort of to keep the lights on or keep the brand promise there. You can layer on these labor forecast limits or staffing minimums to ensure that the overall demand that a schedule will be based on is based on that minimum, even if the business volumes don't warrant that. So I think the question was getting at, if you're using Opus for budgeting, how do you then incorporate these other assumptions? And so that is one area that we've been looking at in our roadmap, in all transparency, as an area we can further incorporate into Opus, both for analysis and planning purposes within that tool, but also potentially as a configuration time saver, as Mike was already speaking to these other elements on the Kronos side. So more to come there, and I'll just do a little plug. We'll be having our first Opus user group meeting in quite some time in November, which we should have that's coming out shortly in terms of an invite, and we'll be discussing that and other roadmap items on that call.
Luke, can I add comment to so I think in terms of budgeting, how I would answer that is, I go back to that meat grill slide. I went to my leaders and said, do you want me to incorporate the workload, the 21 and a half hours, into the job? And if they had said that, I wouldn't have created a separate meat grill job. I would have incorporated that standard into maybe my meat team member and said it's part of their activities. Stop cleaning a counter, go help a customer. So, but my leader said to me, hey, Mike, we want coverage. We want to know somebody's at that grill. And so the ability to have that conversation up front helped inform me what job I created. So then now I have the job, meat grill team member, and that standard now meets to them. So that's how those conversations help drive that design and the choices you make. And I think that decision helped illustrate what path I needed to take in my workforce management design and in my labor standard build. And I think that's why it's so important to incorporate that leadership conversation and understand what's their strategy and what's their philosophy around that. So I'm not making the choice, and I don't have to worry about it when it comes back down to budgeting going, well, you know, the workload's 21 hours, but they got to schedule 56. I now have the labor standard built that way, and that decision was made. And I hope that helps inform, if you're going down that path, have those conversations so that you can make those choices up front. I don't have to worry about it on the budgeting side anymore because that's been built in. I hope that helps why I don't have so many LFLs.
I think so, but you know, why don't we continue on, and if there's more questions, we can address it at the end. So really next we wanted to pivot and talk a little bit about just not how we built labor standards or how we got ready for dimensions, but how did we really arm Save Mart to be able to sustain and manage this beyond simply the WFM solution. So you know, Luke, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit about some of the activities that we did here.
So in order to roll out, you know, both the labor model and the best methods associated with them and any process improvement ideas that came from our project, our engineers partnered with Mike's team to develop what are called visual method sheets, basically visual representations of an SOP for nearly 24 tasks, I believe. We used really the 80-20 rule up front to select the key activities that were either, you know, new processes that needed more definition, like making infused water, or areas that were more complex or timely to execute, where these could go a long way, like making guacamole from scratch, for example. And then areas that were performed with really high frequency, like bagging groceries. And those would have, you know, inherently a sizable impact on labor, so it's important to align the store teams onto the best method. So, you know, what came from this was an example here of a really nice output that Mike's team put together to give their store leaders and associates a common view into the best practice and ensure better adoption. I don't know, Mike, I thought this example was a great one that actually came from someone on your store team.
Yes. So I get asked all the time, what's in the labor standard? Like how do I achieve the labor standard? So I view visual method sheets as my transparency into, if you follow these steps, you're going to achieve the labor standard. Ann Vensky's on this call, who I worked with in the past. She's heard this before, but the money's in the method. If we're going to budget this way, you got to follow these steps because this is how the labor standard's built. To what Luke alluded to is we were doing observations and videotaping of the wall of value changeover in our Food Max banner, and we were trying to find a more efficient way. And we observed one of our team members in our store. His name is David in Brentwood, California, and we actually watched him do it, and we were totally blown away. And we actually took his method and we did method validations and studies to say what was more efficient, and his way was more efficient. So as part of the process, we built the visual method sheet, and we deployed this method as part of our labor standards method improvements. Quite a bit of labor savings from this method, but it also goes back to the transparency. If you want to know what's in my labor standards, here's the visual method sheet, and if you follow this process, here you go. You should achieve that labor standard.
And we knew that, you know, sustaining this wasn't just about field adoption, but also about the folks at corporate, both on Mike's team and some of his business partners, in adopting this new methodology and supporting processes. So we partnered with Mike and the Save Mart team to outline a plan to sustain these results and drive further improvements over time. And it started with what we just went through, the visual method sheets, but also involved, you know, new ways of communicating these efforts with the field to drive more accountability with store managers to ensure they were, you know, also vocalizing the need to be on best method and not just follow the process they'd always done, so that these things were adopted consistently. One of the things I want to drive home was the one team message Mike set up at the top of this. You know, it really involved his team and ours working hand in hand throughout the project. So it wasn't just a final phase in the project of saying, all right, here's your new labor model, go have at it. This meant training, his team, which was interestingly enough a group of former store managers. So they weren't industrial engineers. They had obviously all the background on store process, but not used to using tools like Opus. Or even Excel for that matter. And so fortunately Opus is pretty intuitive. Hopefully the jury agrees. And you don't have to be an engineer to use it. So while it was a lot to take on up
Luke,
front,
I'd like to, so part of the reason I picked Opus over a couple others is it's easy. It's easy to learn. It's easy to use with the training versus send somebody away for 40 hours training and get certified. Part of the allure and the benefit of selecting Opus was I could teach it, or Axsium could teach Opus to my team. Like Luke said, they are former store managers, not skilled in industrial engineering. And part of this, as you look to how do you sustain it, if a person on my team leaves, I can train the person how to use Opus versus having to send them off and be certified and spend 40 hours plus hotels and whatever it takes to get certified. So from a sustainability, that was another key point on picking Opus.
And yeah, with that cross training throughout, and actually his team physically helping to build and validate standards during the project, by the time we were reaching the end of the project, when we would normally transition off to the team, it was that type of training or knowledge transfer was more of an afterthought, and they were ready to own the model, get ready for dimensions implementation, and now start implementing process improvements. And on that note, Mike also had an opportunity to work with his business partners, and I think it was key to bring them along for the ride throughout this process, show them the value of both that his team could bring as well as the Opus tool set, and being an intake partner for any new initiatives that come down the line. So he could do that what if type analysis like he had done, like we had done with the meat grill to evaluate ROI. Mike, you had, I know, about halfway through the project, had an opportunity to actually flex these muscles a bit. Would you mind explaining to everyone what value that brought and what conclusions were drawn?
Sure. So I got, in the middle of the project, I got asked by the pricing team to do a time study on a new type of tags they wanted to implement. And they thought it was faster, so they wanted my team to go do time studies. And I said, we don't do time studies anymore, but we do industrial engineered labor standards. So we took the opportunity to walk them through the methodology and build the labor standards that we had build a set of what-if labor standards for the new tags versus the old tags, and we're able to show the savings on the tags. Within 4 or 5 hours of getting the request, we were able to say, look, this new process saves X amount of time compared to our current process. We were then able to provide the labor savings for the ROI within 4 or 5 hours. And then they took that to our leaders to say, look, if we go to these new tags, yes, there's an upfront cost, but the ROI was, I think, within 4.5 months, we would pay back the initial capital in the labor savings. The cool piece of that is also, once they told me they moved to the new labor standards and we had the tags in place, I was able to update our pricing standards in our system so I could take the hours out because we have the integration to dimensions. And from a budgeting point of view and the effective date of the standard, I can go back and look and made sure I pulled those hours out of the budget for next year's pricing hours. So it really worked full cycle like I envisioned, which is, and the tools allow, which is I have these old standards I can do compare to what if. I can then pull them out of the labor as we implement, and then I can then make sure I budget for it. And on this year's budget, I had to make sure, look, here's the savings from it, from the new tag. So it was a great process, and it really allowed my leaders to go, huh, that's what we're paying for. I got it. So it was a great exercise.
And that sets up the final area around sustainment, which was, building a better budget process. And I think you spoke to a lot of this, but one thing we did within the project on the Axsium side was analyze the output of the labor model, not just with a handful of locations as tends to be the case, but actually importing all the information for all 208 stores for a full year's worth of data and analyzing the impacts of those new labor model hours against what had been spent in the past, either through budgets or actuals. So that gave Mike and team sort of a cheat sheet essentially of what the impact was going to be a few weeks down the line with the Kronos Dimensions rollout, and allowed him and the team to proactively manage any of those changes or make any final tweaks to the model in advance of the pilot. And then with the pilot itself, and then ultimately the rollout later in the summer, now for the first time, the schedules the stores are seeing and the overall budget was aligned, and that will be the case, going forward. As Mike was saying, he's now leveraging Opus to produce budget submissions, analyze the opportunities, factor in initiatives as he spoke to. And Mike, you're taking advantage of a new piece of functionality that was released over the summer. Do you want to quickly explain how that's working for you?
So it's called the planning export. So I go back to the data. We feed our data that the volume drivers that feed Kronos. I actually feed in Opus every week. So I'm able to then use the planning export to pull every store's volume hours and fixed hours on a weekly basis and do my calculations to create a variable hours, so a weekly variable hours versus a average variable hours over the course of the quarter. So it was a new piece of functionality that we were able to take advantage for the 2020 budgets. And we are now, those budgets are now being submitted right now from that data and that workload. And the store's feedback so far is, thank goodness. I don't have to manage the ups and downs of my business because we budgeted on a quarter average. You see the mix changes, you see the seasonality of our product, and now you're accounting for that in our labor models. So far the feedback's been good on it.
Mike, so I think this is a good chance to maybe take a step back, and we covered a lot of ground in this project, this relatively short project. Let's review just some of the key stats that we covered in that 3-4 month period, Mike.
Sure. So we engineered 700 custom labor standards and configured them. We segmented our stores, so we hadn't had segmentation. So our volume drivers segmented, so based on what they're selling, help segment their labor. We had 267 static drivers we used to say further segmented, and we have 52 store properties to turn on or off the labor standards based on processes or equipment. When we started, we evaluated 6 pilot stores, so that's where the stores that we went into on the base to create the model. And then after that, we grew it out to configure all 208 stores of our in Opus. And like Luke said earlier, when we presented to our leaders, we presented, here's the impact to the company, not just the impact to the pilot stores. And that was a big deal to me. I needed to know, hey, is labor standards going to add labor to us because our old model was out of date, or is it going to reduce labor for us? And doing that work with Axsium really helped inform our leaders, hey, here's what we can expect from labor standards. We integrated it, so we're the first client to integrate to Workforce Dimensions and deploy, and we've been in live since April. And then we have 208 stores in our labor model that we load into Dimensions, and they're forecasting their weekly labor and calculating earned hours as well in Dimensions. We have 40 visual method sheets, and then we continue to need to look at that and maintain that so that we can provide transparency to our stores. And we have from the project, something that's always underrated is, as you're out there observing and watching, and our engineers from Axsium and my team, we are able to observe and come up with 24 process improvement recommendations that we can now further refine and help to make our stores more efficient.
Clearly you accomplished a whole bunch, but kind of tactically, and this goes to one of the questions that just came in, is, and I get this question a lot from potential customers or companies that are thinking about doing labor standards work as well, which is this fear that once you go build your labor standards, you're going to find out that you need more labor than you have a budget for. So did you run into that problem, and how did you manage it?
So I didn't have that fear. but my leaders did. So I went in and saying, look, to my leaders, and I had to sell it, and I'm trying to be honest with my leaders, and look, we need to understand what it takes to run our stores. Whether the answer is higher or lower is irrelevant. We need to understand what we're asking our stores to do and how much that costs. From there, we can make decisions after the fact, right? We can either remove tasks, remove frequencies, raise the OP, but let's at least understand what we want our stores to do. Whether we want to pay for it or not, that's a different. So I call it workload. My job first is to measure workload. My second job is payroll. Here's what we can afford, and then help make decisions on how to balance workload and payroll. But I went into the project as, do you know how much it costs to run your store and what it takes? And that was the strategy I went into, and say, we don't know, and so we need to know. And that, I think that message helped alleviate some of my leaders' concern, because at the end of the day, we can either remove tasks or we can raise our operating percents in our budgets to say, look, there's this gap between workload, what we want, what it takes, and what we want to spend. And that's where my leaders have to make their decisions and say, then stop asking them to face the store. We know it's time consuming, let's block, or let's reduce sweep frequencies. So at least we can make smart decisions, or it's also incumbent upon my team to go find those process improvements and implement some of those 24 improvements to say, we can balance workload and payroll if we do this, and make those method changes. So I get the fear, but I think if you confront it head on and say, let's measure workload first before you have that fear, and let me get you the answer. And that's how I approached it.
Well, and along those lines, at the end of the day, if it turns out that you need more labor than you have budgeted for, you still have a budget that you need to operate in. Now you know what the difference is, and you're going to manage to your labor budget, but you can be more intelligent about where you're going to take out labor.
Exactly.
It's an interesting conundrum. But anyway, so what's next for you, Mike? Where is Save Mart going? I'm assuming you're not done with labor standards and with workforce management. What comes next?
So we've completed it. We've started testing machine learning in Dimensions. So we've been working with the Kronos engineers to implement that algorithm. We've talked about it. I'm utilizing Opus for budgeting 2020. We start piloting employee self-service in Kronos Dimensions. So that's a journey. It's one of the side benefits of Dimensions is bringing our stores in 21st century and letting stores use their devices for convenience. We start our time and attendance UAT end of this month, and in November, December, January, February, hope to get all new time clocks and time and attendance out. As we work through that, hope to adopt machine learning forecasting. I'd like to say at Kronos Works, we're on it. We have one store on it right now. Then we have opened a new store. We call it our innovation store. So it's now my team's job to go in and fill the gaps on the new program for the new labor model as we deploy it. So there's some new items there that's not in our labor model. It didn't exist in a store, and now we have the store up and running. So it's go through the methodology Axsium taught us so that my team can maintain that model. And then after that, we're working on how do we build transparency and trust in our labor model. So it's how do we get our stores to look at their properties and know what's in their labor model. And that's a big driver for me. I don't want to show them everything, but I want to show them enough to be there's confidence. So when we say this is the labor you need, they go, oh, yeah, I got it. That makes sense because they got this in my store. And then from there, we need to start working on how do we balance workload and payroll and look for those payroll opportunities, those process improvements, and model it in Opus and come up with the ROI and get those visual method sheets built and deploy those new changes. So it never stops. One of the benefits of Opus is, and the project that we got is my team now can maintain it. We're just planning yesterday in our staff meeting, let's take a new department and rebuild it, one that's changed since. It's amazing how much has changed since we built our labor model for produce. We're going to target produce. There's just so much in this innovation store around produce. We need to update our model already. and I don't want to get behind and get back to the place. So that's what we're working on, and we have the tool and the skill set and methodology down because of our work with Axsium and Kronos.
I appreciate that. So that brings us to the end of our planned content for today. I realize that we're just bumping into the top of the hour right now. We do have a couple of questions in. We can work to address those right now. If you have any other questions, please feel free to use the Q&A window. I do realize, though, that we're at the top of the hour, so if you need to drop off, I won't hold it against you. But why don't we go ahead and address the last couple of questions there.
And Bob, I'm free. I don't have anything after, so I can stay and answer as many questions as there are.
I really appreciate it. So just to kind of pick up that idea of what happened to your budget, or what happened to what did the labor model look like versus what your budget was afterwards? End up over budget as a result of your labor standards build, if you just went with the pure labor standards?
No, we didn't. We actually saved labor, and the reason being is our old labor model, and I'm very general, is our old labor model had old processes. And a lot has changed in 5 years as merchants start understanding how to become more efficient. I mean, there's always pressure on us to be more efficient in the grocery business. So so much has changed, and we were able to show in where we did go up. It was because of the programs that were added that were driving sales. So it was a combination of both, and the way I'll say it is it rebalanced our labor is the best way I can say it as well. Is we had stores that had been fat and happy and had historically been budgeted fat and happy, and we had some other stores that had been squeezed because they had good operators, and as they do year-over-year reviews, obviously last year's performance helped guide next year's performance, and so I'd say we were able to rebalance our labor as well, in stores, in groups, and in departments. But overall, we saw a reduction.
Get that, Mike, and I don't think what you saw was necessarily unusual. Our experience looking across all of the retailers that we work with is that it's unusual to build a labor model and come in over budget, because what we're measuring is what's in the stores today. We're not necessarily looking for process improvement per se. Well, we are looking for process improvement, but we're not measuring that process improvement. So the most likely outcome is you'll come in at about the same spend, but what you'll end up doing is redistributing that spend, whether that's between tasks in the store or between across stores or across departments. It's that redistribution, I think, that we probably see most often.
And I think there's an underrated piece here, Bob, is because we're now doing a sales factor by week versus the average for the quarter. I think that also helped contribute as well, because there's weeks of the month that in our FoodMax banner, it's the low price warehouse banner, they would get the same factor where in the beginning of the month they needed more and in the end of the month they needed less, but we gave them the average, right? So I think that weekly sales factor also helped contribute to some of the savings we saw.
Another question that came in was around how you're using the labor model, and I think you touched on this a little bit, but maybe you can expand on it. Is that for Save Mart, you're using the labor model not just for forecasting, but you're actually using it for your long-term budgeting, and you're actually using it right now for next year's budget. Can you talk just a little bit more about what you're doing there and how you're using it?
Well, I think you summed it up really well, Bob, is we have our labor model in Opus that with the active standards that are production, we call them the status is production standards, that we use to inform our weekly schedule. So as Kronos forecasts the volume drivers, the labor standards are being bounced apart to say, here's where we want you to spend the labor and here's how much labor you get by job. Because we have those standards and we feed our volume drivers into Opus on a weekly basis, I'm able to inform on the actuals. So because I have the actual sales, I have the actual volume data, I'm able to create a kind of a budget for that week looking back. and say, okay, if everything was perfect, here's how many hours we should have used based on that store's mix, and that's what I use for next year's budget. Now, obviously, I do a little week adjustments if Easter and Thanksgiving and stuff like that, but I have the tools now to budget 52 weekly budgets based on actual data and actual sales. So that's how I'm using it. And then the other piece is the what if. What if we change this process? How much labor would we save? And in some cases, how much labor do we got to add? I have a analysis I have to do this week with the VP of Bakery on a new bread program, and how much labor does it add? And then go to the leaders of the company and say, we need to add this much more into our bakery hours for next year because of this program change. So I use it in all the facets we've talked about today, for scheduling, for what-if analysis, and for budgeting.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. And thank you all for your attendance today. As a reminder, if you liked this session and you wanted to dive into a little bit more detail, or if you wanted to talk to Mike or Axsium one-on-one or in a small group, we are going to be at Kronos Works, which is happening in Las Vegas in early November, so November 10th through the 13th, and we will kind of dive into this at a little bit more detail then. Also, just as a reminder, week we're holding our webinar with Infor and Zoomies on the 24th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And then last but not least, please remember to save the date for our UK and US forums held next spring. It would be great to see you guys face to face. Thank you again for your time today, for that questions. I think it was a great conversation, and thank you, Mike and Luke, for your thought and your time. We will talk to you all again very, very soon.